Yeah. I got the link off of it. I don't think it was. Okay. I think it was. Yeah. He sent you some got like the first 4 about minus and then 5 is not a swag. So we're well positioned to kind of like give both things as opposed to. Yeah. But I'll pass on the file. Yeah, no. I like, you guys have done something really awesome. I'm slightly jealous that I haven't done it as aggressively as I did. Because I have such a great product, I would have loved to have. Hey, you're still in there. I get work with you. Originally, yeah. Basically, it was just, in Washington.
Hey folks, welcome to the Brookings Institution. My name is Benjamin Wittes. I'm a senior fellow in governance studies and the editor of Lawfare. I can't think of a more unpleasant occasion on which to gather here. This is, as you know, the 3rd anniversary of the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we are here to talk about a variety of matters related to that and related as well to an immense ongoing change of U.S. policy with respect to the war. We are also here to introduce a project that we have been working at Lawfare for the last year or so, which we will talk about and introduce, which is a project that we've done with our colleagues at Goat Rodeo on the history of U.S.-Ukrainian relations in the post-Soviet period vis-a-vis Russia. So if that sounds well-timed to the moment, perhaps it is. I can't think of a group of people that I would rather talk about this subject with than the group that is sitting on stage with me. First of all, let me just go from left to right. Constanza Steldenmuller is the head of the Center for United States and Europe, which is hosting this event, and to whom we are all guests. Seated next to her is Tyler McBrien, who is the managing editor of Lawfare and one of the co-hosts of the Escalation podcast. Seated next to him is Anastasia Lopatina, who is the other co-host of the Escalation podcast, is joining us from Kyiv. And to my left is the great Fiona Hill, who is a senior fellow here and, among other things, plays a sort of starring role in a number of the episodes of the podcast, including the first one, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. Before we do, however, we arranged this event when there was one major government change that was affecting Western policy toward Ukraine. And that was the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration and the shock therapy, maybe, that is applying to the situation. There is now a second one, which is that we did have elections in Germany yesterday, and these produced something of a mixed message with respect to Ukraine policy. And so I wanted to ask Constanza to get us started and give us a sense of what happened in Germany yesterday, how we should understand it vis-a-vis Ukraine, and how we should understand it vis-a-vis the American shift in policy ongoing with respect to Ukraine.
So thank you very much. And it is a distinct pleasure to co-host this with you because the Center on the U.S. and Europe has taken the changes wrought on Europe and on the transatlantic relationship by the Russians' full-scale invasion extremely seriously. It has literally reconfigured the way we work in every possible way. And I couldn't think of a better thing to do today with a better group of people. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
As for the German election, I'm still processing it. But to those of you who occasionally follow the news, it will not have escaped you that the incoming new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, has made some newsworthy comments, both yesterday and in previous days, on Europe's need for nuclear weapons, on what seems to him like the end of transatlantic relations, and so on. Suffice it to say that this is a Chancellor who, in all fairness, like his predecessor Olaf Scholz, is deeply committed to Europe and also to the transatlantic relationship and the friendship with America, except that he's committed to the old transatlantic relationship and the America that he grew up with. So the current shifts in Washington are, I think, going to make that slightly difficult for him. Now, I don't want to joke about what is a deeply serious situation. I have just come back from 3 weeks in Europe, and the real turmoil in the transatlantic relationship started with J.D. Vance's, the vice president's speech in Munich on Valentine's Day, February 14th. I was in the overflow of the overflow of the overflow room listening to it because every single participant of the Munich Security Conference wanted to hear it. And Fiona was there as well, and I think it is fair to say that Europeans were profoundly shocked by it. I have been making the rounds in Europe, not just in Germany, but also I'm coming from Stockholm, and the Swedes who thought they had joined NATO just in time are now finding that they are joining a slightly different NATO than they thought they joined. So there is turmoil everywhere, and people are processing things everywhere. But let me give you a capsule version of what I think happened last night in Germany. We always knew that the Conservatives were going to win this election. They polled at double the polling levels of the governing SPD. The question was, how many parties would Friedrich Merz have to govern with? And that was settled very late last night with a real nail-biter of a counting of votes. BSW, the extreme left party, led by the firebrand Sarah Wagenknecht, missed entry into the parliament, missed the 5% threshold by 13,000 and something votes. It will not surprise you to learn that they are going to go to the courts over this and demanding a recount, which is unusual in Germany. But there we are. I think we're catching up with other countries. So Friedrich Merz, based on that result, and unless it is overturned by the courts, which I have a hard time seeing because we all use paper ballots, it's slightly more difficult to sort of fake results there. Friedrich Merz is going to govern in a grand coalition with the Social Democrats. And I don't think that he will have any compunction in supporting Ukraine. I think he intends to be a strong player in Europe. The reservations I have about that is that last night also saw a doubling of the AfD seats in parliament, nearly a doubling of its vote share, with extremely high shares in Eastern Germany of up to 37%. In total, they have
AfD, just for
the hard extreme right
neo-Nazi
alternative for
party.
Germany. No, they're not neo-Nazi. That's not precise.
Okay.
They are good friends with neo-Nazi groupings, but they are not by definition neo-Nazi, and I think that is an important thing to say. The German Domestic Intelligence Service have determined them to be, in part or in some of the state-level organizations, fully extremist, right-wing extremist. But they have been very careful in avoiding, except for some, fringe figures and one or two of their leaders, in avoiding actual Nazi language. Also, forgive me. I say that because it is they are doing this very deliberately and strategically. And it is one of the things that makes it difficult, for example, to outright ban them, which German law would allow, which I'm no doubt the Vice President of the United States would consider yet another suppression of free speech and democracy. if that was attempted. But that is where we are. I think Friedrich Merz will be quite constrained by an opposition headed by an extreme right-wing party that will be out to hunt him and that will be out to split his party. I think he will try to reach out to Europe. He will try to reach out to NATO. But I am going to put out there that ultimately I think he may end up being a transitional figure in what is going to be an ever more fragmenting German political landscape, and I'll leave it at that.
All right. Fiona, you were also at Munich. Give us a sense of your impressions of where the United States is right now with respect to Ukraine and with respect to European interactions on that subject.
Well, thanks very much. I would say it's great to be here today, but I guess for all of us it isn't really, is it? It's quite a depressing, as you said at the very beginning, anniversary and commemoration, especially for Anastasia and others who are from Ukraine itself. And I think before we, start to do this analysis, we just want to fully process, what Ukrainians have been through during this last 3 years. And I mean, this is an absolute tragedy for Ukrainians. I mean, it's one of the reasons that Anastasia and others are here. And we have to always remember the human side of this. And I just wanted to say that I listened to Vice President Vance's speech, standing next to Andriy Yatsenyuk, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, who I happened to meet as I went into the overflow room of the overflow room. I'm not quite sure which overflow room I was in, but there were many. And I did actually try to attempt to intercede on his behalf with people who were guarding the main room to see if he could enter. I tried the old former Prime Minister of Ukraine routine for him, but it didn't work. So he was stuck standing next to me. And he literally turned to me and said he thought he was going to cry after hearing the speech. And this is obviously a kind of a man who's been through, quite a lot. So that will just, put things into perspective. There is a human side to all of this that we must not forget. And I want to, in a way, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to kind of flip it around a little bit, because it's what has the United States done to itself in the eyes of Europeans, which was really depressing to listen to. So I came to the United States in 1989, when there was a complete shift in the Cold War. And I came here with, I guess, starry, rosy eyes. I became a US citizen. I never thought that I would find myself in a position where I was listening to Europeans, and the UK used to be part of Europe, remember, before Brexit, and also, UK and other politicians talk about the United States as an adversary. And that was exactly what started to happen after the Vice President's speech. Because suddenly, it was as if a switch had been flipped. I was also standing next to a prominent member of the German Green Party, whose family were refugees from the former Soviet Union, who's extraordinarily well known. He said he was sick to his stomach. He never expected that the beacon, kind of a freedom and opportunity that everybody had looked towards from the kind of Cold War onwards was suddenly, basically lecturing Europeans about free speech, and also openly siding with, as Constanza has discussed, an extreme right-wing party. It was not something that anybody in that hall could have fully processed. Now, the Europeans also know that they have themselves, and this is kind of writ large, something to blame for this predicament and this state of affairs. So, like Constanza, I've been spending a lot of time going around Europe. 2 years ago, I lived in Germany for 5 or 6 months. Just after the so-called Zeitenwende, the period when the previous Chancellor Scholz realized that the world had changed rather dramatically after Russia's invasion. And it was also very sobering to see that there was a kind of sense of helplessness and paralysis in Germany over this, which, Merz is obviously the response to, in some respects, to those, Constanza says, a very fractured electorate. I've been spending a lot of time in the United Kingdom, my home birthplace. I still remain a dual citizen there. I've also just been in Paris, coincidentally at the same time that many of the European leaders showed up for a kind of an emergency meeting in the wake of the Vance speech. And like Constanza, Scandinavia, and all kinds of other countries in between. And there's a real feeling that the Europeans really mismanaged and wasted not just the last several years after the invasion of Ukraine, But the last decade plus since the Wales summit, where President Obama basically exhorted all of them to think about taking their own defence more into consideration and to all reach 2% spending of GDP. So that was 2014. That was coterminous with the first invasion of Ukraine and the seizing of Crimea. And now the realization has set in the kind of 10 years, that they're 10 years behind being really serious about their own defence. So that was also that moment where it became obvious that basically farming out your security to the US was no longer an option. And they've been told that nicely for quite some time. Now they were told in a rather brutal fashion, not just by Vice President Vance, but also by new Secretary of Defense Hegseth, that Europe is no longer a priority for the United States. And we've always thought, when we're looking at Ukraine, getting back to your initial question, as we got into a war of attrition, and some of you will remember this from earlier discussions we've had here at Brookings and all kinds of writings that various people have had, that the one way that you get a shift in a war of attrition is where the external environment has a major change. And this has been the major change, not, as many might have hoped, a shift in the dynamics inside of Russia, which has been a bit of a solid rock for the last 25 years and remains so. Putin hasn't really budged in terms of his worldview. But the shift has been here in the United States. The United States, as we all know, because we've been living in it, has been in a process of constant change for the last 25 years, going back to 9/11, the interventions in Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, etc., etc. I mean, we have been literally all over the place. And finally, it's the United States that has changed. And in Moscow, the feeling is the United States has converged with Russia and with Russian views. And that's what shifted the entire dynamic. And so that's actually where we are now with Ukraine. The United States has shifted, and Europe has realized that if it wants to be serious about its own security, and also about a long-term settlement for Ukraine, which is essential to European security, then they need to change as well. And that's going to be the big question as we look ahead. We have President Macron of France coming into town today. He may already be here. He's not joining us, as I learned, for our
he's
for our
welcome
session.
on the stage.
It would be great to hear from him, but I'm sure we'll be hearing plenty from him. And we've got Prime Minister Starmer of the UK coming in on Thursday. And the writing is very much on the wall for everybody that Ukraine's future is also the future of European security. And the Finns and the Swedes, who did join NATO, also joined precisely because they realized that you need to have a new look of European security. And the Finns, let's just remind ourselves, are actually all ready to go. They are probably one of the best equipped, most battle-ready at all times militaries, because they had the Ukraine experience back in the beginning of World War II, when they were invaded also by the Soviet Union and had to fight them off all on their own. And they've never, basically lost that dynamic and that importance. So I think, but it's a really consequential time today where every chicken has come home to roost.
Yes, thank you. I want to pick up on something you said at the beginning, which is that we have to not forget the personal tragedy and experience of Ukrainians in this conversation. And so, Nastya, I want to ask you to tell us two stories. The first is, what were the circumstances in which you learned about the American change in policy? You literally were on your way from Kiev to here to do this event and to launch this podcast when all of a sudden the United States switched sides. So first of all, I want you to just tell us about that experience. And then secondly, in the back, although she may be here, is your one-year-old daughter. And I want you to tell us the circumstances of Ava's birth.
It will be relevant, I promise.
The details may not be important.
We'll admit the gruesomeness of it all, but thank you, and thank you for arranging all of this. It's amazing to have an opportunity to speak about it all. So yes, when Trump I don't think Trump decided to flip a switch. When a bunch of Ukrainians realized who he actually is, that's more like it, I was somewhere between the 3 trains and 2 planes and the 4-day-long travel from Ukraine to here. And I couldn't help but think that, like, my whole life I've had an image of the US as this kind of, standard of what is right and what is good. And when the Revolution of Dignity happened in Ukraine, I was tiny. I was 12 or 13. And that's sort of like, since then, I have conscious memory of my life and what's right and what are my values.
Yeah, it's 2014.
Yes. And since then, I've always known that, like, this is who we are as Ukrainians. We align ourselves with the West. We look to the US for guidance. We look to Europe for guidance. This is what's right, and what's on the East is very, very wrong, and we never look there. And so I'd always joke that, like, we don't mind American meddling, when some of my more leftist-leaning friends, would accuse the U.S. of neocolonialism or something when it comes to Ukraine. I'd be like, we actually love it. Like, please come and clean everything up. Like, get rid of corruption. Like, get involved. Like, and many people who joke about this because, the alternative for us has always been Russia, right? Because the geography really messed us up. We're really stuck in there, in between 2 sides, and so this whole image of the U.S. as this barometer of what's good and bad, it really shattered for me in the last week. And I keep saying, I keep hearing people say that there is no going back, that this damage that Trump has done is kind of irreversible, and you will explain to me later whether that's true, better than I do. But that's just, like, really depressing, because now I feel like, the U.S. is sort of gone and doing whatever it is that it's doing. Europe isn't really doing anything. And as one friend of mine put it, it would be nice if Europe was a thing. Like, that would be helpful. So that's certainly how Ukrainians view it, because Ukrainians, and we'll get to that, have had bad experiences with the U.S. over history and with Europe as well. And so we now really feel like we're once again just, like, left on our own. And it's really not a position that anyone should be in. And we now don't even have a standard, like, of institutionalism or of values and liberty. Like, we're now being accused of being a dictatorship, which is laughable, right? And so there is this just, like, prevailing feeling of disappointment that everything I've always thought of as right and good connected to the US, like, it's all shattering kind of in front of my eyes, and it affects the entire country. So that's just really depressing. So the spicier story about how I was birthed. So my daughter, she's sleeping, thank God. She's very much cooperating with this event, and I'm grateful for it. She was born on December 31st in 2023. And, that's already crazy enough. The whole thing is crazy enough. What's even crazier is that the next day after that, Russia launched one of its biggest ever aerial attacks against Ukraine. I think it was January 1st or January 2nd. So at the time that, we were still at the hospital, we haven't checked out and left home yet, at 5 a.m. at some point, there is this massive attack. I mean, it's like almost 100 drones or something. I may be exaggerating, but it was really big. At that point, it was called one of the biggest attacks in years. And so it was just incredible, right? Because we were fine. We were all taken to this underground shelter with dozens of very pregnant women. And I was only, like, very thankful that I've already, got her out. So I don't have to go through that experience in a bunker. So, that was helpful. But I distinctly remember the feeling that me and people around me, other moms with, like, 1-year-old babies, we weren't scared because we've been at this for years at that point, and we've lived there since the very beginning. We were just very annoyed. There was this, like, frustration that, like, we really shouldn't be dealing with this, like, in any circumstance, but especially right now. And I really didn't spot fear in people's eyes. It was more of like, okay, like, when is this going to be over? Like, can we just go and, like, have a life and take care of our babies? And I think it's so tragic that those were the emotions that we're feeling, because that means that, like, we're all, not all, I can't speak for all, but a lot of us are pretty much numb at this point, because we we see this gruesomeness and this tragedy every single day. And at some point, unfortunately, even though I'd prefer that we kept feeling, the strongest empathy and the strongest sense of loss, at some point, something in your body on a biological level just adapts, and that just becomes a part of your life, and you end up being in interviews with Iranian drones flying around you, and you're not going anywhere because God bless American air defense, and you'll be fine, most likely. And you just keep on living with it, and people tell you, stay safe, and you don't even know what that means anymore because that's just your reality. And so it's just the fact that we've been at it for 3 years is insane to me, because I remember having a conversation with a friend in early April 2022, so just around a month since the full-scale invasion started, after the full-scale invasion started. And I was in Lviv at this time, a city in eastern Ukraine. And I wanted some of my friends to come stay with me, and they fully seriously told me that they don't want to leave Kyiv because they want to be there for Victory Day. And so my friends didn't come because they had this distinct feeling that they were on the precipice of this historic moment, right? They were ready to march through Hrishatik in their vishvankas and flags and celebrate it. But now it's 3 years later, and I'm, sitting here, and we're going to talk about how our biggest ally is turning into something of an enemy. And so, that's, I guess, is where we're at.
So I just want to say, if that sounds dramatic, Nastya is actually understating it. I woke up that morning to a set of texts from her, which I think I still have, that this was January 1st, 2024. And the first one said, the good news is I have a beautiful baby girl. The bad news is I'm in a bomb shelter under the hospital with a whole bunch of laboring moms. And
you don't know what to think, because on one hand, it's a hospital. No one targets a hospital, but then you're like, no, they're Russians. They actually might
because
deliberately
there was
target
an attack
hospital.
on a maternity hospital at one point.
Yes.
And so, all right, well, I don't mean to be glib, but the good news is we got a rip-roaring podcast out of it. So Tyler,
you're gonna set this one up.
Yeah, no, I mean you
smooth, Ben. Thank you.
You gotta take lines where they present themselves. So Tyler, tell us a little bit of the story of Escalation and how this project had its genesis and where it came from. Give us a little bit of the sort of institutional history of the project we're releasing today.
Yes, thanks, Ben, and thanks to everyone. I'm honored to be up here with this panel. I think the past 3 weeks especially have been a bit of a proof of concept for Escalation, to say the least. This podcast started, I guess 3 years ago, you could say, with the full-scale invasion. And about a year in, maybe, I had joined Lawfare as managing editor. The biggest story in foreign policy in the world at the time, and in many ways still is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it just seemed like, on the one hand, an obvious choice to think about how we could tell the history of the U.S. and Ukraine and how to explain what we were seeing. I am certainly no Russia expert. I'm no Ukraine expert. So it's not surprising that I was surprised at the full-scale invasion, but I got the sense that even people who have been watching this closely were also surprised. So we wanted to answer that question. Around that time, I believe Nastya had been doing amazing reporting for the Kyiv Independent, and Ben was hosting a show called Live from Ukraine, and Nastya had joined one of those episodes. And what was really important, I think, of that show was to get a sense of what it was like for Ukrainians in Ukraine at the time. I think this conflict especially has been the victim of a lot of misinformation and revisionism. And so a podcast that really lays out the history of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, we felt was so important to set the record straight. And I'll just say one more thing, that working with Nastya over the past year, I think you got a good sense of how it was a really healthy dose of perspective every time I was maybe feeling tired and trying to finish up an edit or something. And it was quite humbling then to have someone on the other end of Zoom who is 8 years younger than I am, has an infant, is under bombardment, is in an air raid shelter. And I think that's also what we're trying to do with this podcast is really drive home what this experience is like and what the stakes are.
So I want to, one of the key voices, perhaps the key voice in the first episode, is Fiona, who tells this incredible story about that I think most Americans have, if they ever knew of, and I certainly did at one point because I lived through it, but I'd completely forgotten about it, which is how reticent the United States administration was about the idea of Ukrainian independence to begin with. And one of the themes that we've been exploring in the podcast is this recurrent cycle of American policymakers not being as fully on board for the idea of an independent Ukraine as they later imagined themselves to have been. And a lot of these episodes seem to involve European cities that begin with BU. But this one actually involved the president going to Kyiv and making a speech not quite against Ukrainian independence, but almost against Ukraine.
I'd say it was against. Just saying.
It was certainly not for. Let's. And so, Fiona, take us back. You have this incredible line in the first episode where you say, you know, I graduated from my master's program, and then the field that I was in went out of existence a few months later. But tell us the story of President Bush and his speech to the Ukrainian parliament.
You know, I'm catching the eye here of an old colleague of mine, Marcia McGraw-Olive, who will remember all of this very well. We worked together at the Eurasia Foundation. You know, back in the early 1990s, it kind of kicked off thinking about this new transformed landscape after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But yes, I did a master's in Soviet studies, which soon became history, and I did a PhD in history afterwards, thinking I needed to rapidly retool after I got my degree in the June of 1991. At the same time as Edward Shevardnadze, the last foreign minister of the Soviet Union, was getting an honorary degree in the same ceremony and was looking very perplexed, you know, sort of sitting on the stage. And he was soon to be the first president of an independent Georgia. So, I mean, this is taking us back, you know, a long time to 1991, because by the end of that year, the Soviet Union it hadn't really collapsed, actually. And that's actually something that's also very important to remember, that it got picked apart by some of the elites at the top, including Boris Yeltsin, the first president of an independent Russia, because they wanted to get rid of Mikhail Gorbachev, because they needed a reconstitution, a reform, a revamping of, it sounds a little familiar about where we're sitting at the moment, of the Soviet system. And the heads of the republics of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine got together to basically dismantle the Soviet Union, intending to keep together in some part. But before that, as this starts to kind of move through the whole system towards this amazing and really kind of dramatic set of events, George H.W. Bush indeed goes off to Kiev and starts to make an appeal for, you know, the guys to keep the band together. And I mean, it's very interesting to think back on this. Next year, of course, is our 250th anniversary of the US's own independence, sloughing off the Mad King George and the United Kingdom. And it's quite remarkable to think where we've come in 250 years if we start to think about what that anniversary is going to look like next year. And yet we've had a hard time, despite the fact of being a revolutionary power, a power that's fought for its independence, of really kind of going along with others when they've come to that moment as well. And I think that's because in the meantime, the United States started to become something of an imperial power itself over time. After being helped by the French to keep the Brits, kind of out of the picture again, during the whole period of 1812, etc. After that, we kind of moved on, pretty much doing the same thing as other great world powers were doing at the time too, expanding our territory, etc., etc. And so George H.W. Bush is feeling very uncomfortable at the idea of a really kind of what he fears will be, and he was quite right in many respects, a chaotic becoming a part of the Soviet Union. We've always told ourselves that in fact, it was almost violent and conflict-free, and that was not the case at all. And in fact, what we're still in the middle of is the wars of the Soviet succession. And so this is kind of like 1812. It's, you know, kind of the whole uproar all over again, because Ukraine had been independent, you know, for 30-plus years by the time Russia tries to kind of take it back in the fold again. And in some respects, remember that George H.W. Bush had been the head of the CIA at one point. He might not have been far wrong in thinking that we were heading, you know, to some kind of, you know, disastrous outcome down the line if all of this kind of came apart.
Yeah, it's an extremely powerful little story that I think represents something larger, both in Ukraine's relationship with the United States, which is the subject of the podcast, but also, Constanza, in Ukraine's relationship with Europe, because you have this moment where Ukraine becomes independent, but everybody continues to look at Ukraine through the lens of Russia, and that includes particularly European countries who see Ukraine to some degree as a transit situation for Russian natural gas. And I guess, you know, there's this, we clearly see from the Trump administration that this has not changed in the case of the United States. We are back to thinking of Ukraine as something that you negotiate directly with Moscow about, without even having Ukrainians at the table. Has Europe learned the lesson that we clearly have not learned?
All right. I knew when I signed up for this that I was going to be the damn European on this panel.
No, you're the blessed European on the... Are you kidding?
That's all right. It's all good. Look, I think there is a lot of fair criticism to lob at Europe and at Germany over its behavior in the past 10 years, including the fears of the Scholz-led coalition of escalation, right? That said, I do think that circumstances have changed completely. The other place I went to before the Munich Security Conference was Brussels. I spent 3 days running around NATO, the European External Action Service, and the European Commission. And I think, you know, well, before I get to that, I want to perhaps say something slightly more personal, because Anastasia, like you, I was a reporter for a long time, and my time as a reporter began in the years after the fall of the wall. But because I had trained as a lawyer and as a human rights lawyer, my paper said human rights stories, Rwanda, the Balkans, Afghanistan. So I spent a lot of time covering war crimes and finally war crimes tribunals. And I am angry every time I read about Russian bombardments of Ukraine. I wake up angry every bloody morning and I go to bed angry about this, right? This is not okay, right? And I think I can tell you that many of my fellow Europeans and people in my field feel the same way. A visceral, profound anger at Russia. There is no going back for my generation, right, to a comfy relationship with Russia that goes over the head of a country that has been attacked and is attacked every day. I want to make that very clear. Okay. I also want to say, Anastasia, that if we are completely fair, some of those air defenses that are protecting Kyiv right now are Danish and German.
Yes.
Right? And
yes.
And exactly.
Norwegian.
And
yes.
right. And so, and if you look at the numbers, we have the President of the United States currently telling us that we don't do anything for Ukraine financially or with military support. I think we all know that if we look at the numbers, those tell another story.
And Sweden just made a major commitment.
Yeah,
over
and
the
the Danes and so on. I mean, and I will say the other thing here that's operating here, apart from profound anger, right, about what is being done to Ukraine and the lies being told about that in Moscow and elsewhere is, of course...
And in Washington now.
Why don't you just let me put it my way? The other thing that, of course, is motivating Europeans is a very real, very visceral fear about the degree of Russian disinformation and sabotage in Europe and in Germany. There was especially an amount of meddling in the German election that we have not seen, I think, since the Cold War, and maybe not even then. And the intelligence services across Europe, but also in Germany, even in Germany, I should say, because they were long very reticent about this, have been extremely forthright in calling this out and attributing it immediately. And I think the Russians have stopped bothering trying to hide their signatures. The people I met in Brussels were working day and night. We're working day and night to cobble together support for Ukraine. We're working day and night to cobble together additional money for European defense. And we're working day and night. And literally, I mean, one of my meetings started at 9:15 in the evening, not in the morning. Let me perhaps end on a point that is easy to, it's easy to say that this is all performative, but the entire European Commission and its leadership and the leader of the Council and 13 heads of state are today in Kiev to mark the anniversary. That has to turn into policy, right? That has to turn into money. That has to turn into more weapons. But I think it would not be quite fair to say that that's not meaningful, right? All the people that I met meant it deeply, and I think my generation knows that this is the conflict of our lifetime and that the future of Europe depends on its resolution in favor of Ukraine.
I'd just like to add something important to what Constanza said here, because although it might not feel it from the United States, and the further, obviously, you get away from Washington, D.C., it definitely doesn't feel it. And over the last 3 years, I've spent a lot of time going all the way around the country talking to audiences about why Ukraine actually is relevant for the United States, not just because of Ukrainian Americans, but because of actually the dependence that America has had on the larger international system that was really rooted in the transatlantic alliance, and how we've actually prospered from it over this time. And again, we've kind of forgotten all of that as time has gone on. I mean, in the UK, they forgot about why Europe was relevant and, very blithely voted for Brexit, for example. So it's not unheard of to kind of, lose the plot over time and forget about where things are. But in Europe right now, people know that they're under siege from Russia all the time. So as we're sitting here talking, an inquest has been going on in London about the death of Dawn Sturgis. It's not probably a household name here, but I'm sure that some of you know who she is. She is the woman who, very unfortunately, was killed by Novichok from the bottle of perfume that the Russian GRU, the military intelligence, discarded in a charity donation bin that her partner found and brought home, and they spread this perfume on each other, discovering, in fact, that it was a deadly weapons-grade nerve agent that had just been used to poison a former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia in the town of Salisbury. Now, the only reason this was uncovered is because the UK has a facility near Salisbury, Porton Down, where they, a bit like we have in Frederick, Maryland, where they can do testing for nerve agents, biological and chemical weapons. So only 8 countries knew that this Novichok even existed. So it was by chance that this, actually happened there. And it was able to be revealed. And this is only one, of course, of assassinations that have taken place on British soil. There was Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned by polonium, a radiological agent, so the first dirty bomb that was used on British soil, and also spread polonium all the way around the United Kingdom. There's lots of evidence of intervention in pretty much every European election. Constant assassinations, exactly, in the Tiergarten, and of course constant attacks on critical national infrastructure through cyber attacks. In fact, the biggest threat to Europe today is a critical national infrastructure. And pipelines and cables under the Baltic Sea, the Estonians, the Swedes.
That's a bigger threat than the threats to our freedom and democracy.
Etc. And so all of this is real in Europe. So Europeans know that what Ukraine has experienced, the destruction of its critical national infrastructure, all of the interventions that have been made in Ukraine's politics before is what they're facing as well. So although, again, we may be remote here, it doesn't feel remote in the US. And I would say if you look actually now in polling that I saw like last week in the UK, for example, where, of course, the relationship with the United States is extraordinarily important, 48% of people said in a poll that it was more important to stick by Ukraine than it was to improve the relationship with the United States at this point, 48%. In terms of favouring sticking by the United States, it was in the 20s, 20%. There was a lot of people said they didn't know because it's a hard point to be put. But we're seeing really a shift here where people in Europe now see that their situation is on the line. So again, that rupture that we mentioned before is real, and it's a really sobering thought. And again, as I said before, chickens have come home to roost. A lot more should have been done. Many of us have been putting this, on the agenda for Europe for a long time. But it is real, the security threat in Europe. It's not just imagined, it's not just disinformation, and it's now viscerally felt.
So Tyler, I want to ask you, I referred earlier to this cycle that began with what came to be called George H.W. Bush's Chicken Kyiv speech, so named by the columnist William Safire, in which, sort of Ukrainians expect American backing and they don't get it at the level that they expected or that we promise it. And this is we may be going through what I think is the sort of fourth and most dramatic cycle of that, where we actually side with the Russians. But all of these episodes have to do with Ukraine's relationship with Russia. And one of the roles that you play in the podcast is kind of as the sort of naive American who's kind of never...
It came pretty naturally.
It's a persona because Tyler is anything but naive. But you're the guy who's like, gee, I didn't know this happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And to any other naive Americans listening or younger listeners, chicken Kyiv is used pejoratively, which is, you may not know because it's a delicious dish and it's a... But... No, I mean, you're absolutely right. It is the history of the U.S. and Ukraine since independence in 1991 has been one of misunderstandings and betrayals. And one of our episodes is called "The Worst of Both Worlds" because
also features Fiona.
Exactly right.
In one of her prior lives.
The New York Times had an editorial, I believe, over the weekend in which it condemns what they called a complete 180 in U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine. And I was thinking that that's not maybe absolutely true. It's the U.S. You mentioned that the U.S. has viewed Ukraine for a long time through Russian lenses, through a Russian lens. There was a Ukrainian diplomat named Boris Tarasyuk, who we speak to on the podcast, who said the very same thing. He says that the U.S. always looks at Ukraine through Russian glasses and sort of plays by their terms. And so, it seems that the Trump administration is looking at this history and picking the worst lessons and accelerating them and acting on that. I will say, though, that there was reporting, I believe, this morning out in Bloomberg that the U.S. may commit to a sovereign Ukraine in the negotiations, which is heartening. Whether or not they listened to the first episode of Escalation, I'm not sure. I can't confirm or deny that, but it just seems like that's obviously the bare minimum. But it is.
Can I just point out that we've done that before? Like, that's the Budapest memo, right?
Yeah.
And this will be less of the sovereign Ukraine than it started out with 3 years ago.
Yeah, so,
exactly.
So walk us through a couple of those cycles, because there are, as I joked earlier, they do tend to be named for cities in Europe that start with BU. the first cycle is the independence of Ukraine itself, right? The Chicken Kyiv speech. The second cycle comes only a few years later. What happens?
Right, so I believe you're referring to the Budapest Memorandum, which I think maybe a few years ago, you ask Americans who are very well versed in foreign policy and in U.S. foreign policy history, it's not a household name, let's put it, but in Ukraine it very much is.
And by the way, the only moment of true comedy in the entire podcast is at the beginning of the second episode, where our producer Max, who's sitting here in the front row, asks a young Ukrainian activist who is sitting back there, Maria Hlitin, what do you think of the Budapest memo? And she exclaims, "Oh my God, it's a total fail." and you know, this is something that is not in the consciousness of the average American, but you ask a Ukrainian about the Budapest memo, this is fresh in the front of their mind.
You have to hear how she said it, though, for full drama. So make sure to listen to that.
So to catch us up to speed, in broad strokes, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a large part of the nuclear arsenal left by the Soviets actually was in Ukraine. They couldn't really operate it. A lot of the command and control was back in Moscow. It was very expensive to maintain. But nuclear weapons comes with some degree of security. But the deal that was struck was that Ukraine would give up the nuclear weapons for financial incentives, as well as, from the American perspective, assurances of Ukrainian security. From the Ukrainian perspective, I think there was an understanding that it was more of a guarantee. There was two different translations, actually. And I think this is emblematic of the relationship. The U.S. wanted some sort of ambiguity to give it more room to maneuver, but that maneuvering, or that room only left room for Russia to take advantage of the ambiguity, basically. And I'll also just end by saying, you know, in learning about this, I think it was very important for Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons. Nastya disagreed, and we sort of had this thing come where it was a microcosm of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship every time we would argue about an episode in the narrative arc and everything. But I think the Budapest memo is a great example.
Yeah, so one of the striking things about that story, when we talked to diplomats at the very senior levels, when we talked to people who were literally, in one case, my sister's college roommate, who was a 22-year-old diplomat at Embassy Kyiv at this time, is how guilty they feel about the Budapest Memorandum. And, you know, there's actually sound from Bill Clinton talking about how much he regrets it. It's a remarkable thing that I learned from the reporting of this, which is just how many people have regrets about what we did in that context. Fiona, there's another city in Europe that begins with BU, another European capital that where there was an understanding reached that you played a substantial role in a number of years later, that also shows up as one of these kind of recurrent cycles of are not being able to kind of form a coherent policy. Tell us about what happened in Bucharest.
Yes, and I just wanted to quickly add on the Budapest Memorandum. I'd mentioned Edward Shevardnadze before. Edward Shevardnadze, when he was president of Georgia, had actually told his Ukrainian counterparts, see if you can keep one or two of the nuclear weapons. When they were giving them up around the time of the Budapest Memorandum. They're like, what do we do? Stick them in a closet, you know, kind of, because he basically, he had been, of course, the Soviet foreign minister, and he said he'd seen documents about what would happen if any of the Soviet republics had tried to secede. And he said you might find that they might come in handy later. Which, of course, if Ukraine had still been a nuclear state, and Belarus had been as well, Belarus has been pretty much swallowed up by Russia. Ukraine probably wouldn't have been invaded. And the non-proliferation consequences of all of this are real too, because Constanza and others have been noting that in Germany and in many other places now there's talking about Europe needing to have a bomb. And, what's also the message to Japan, South Korea, other countries who feel threatened. And Bucharest, just so we can get back to this point as well, becomes important in that context because it's another effort to give Ukraine and Georgia at the time, some kinds of guarantees for their future security. Now, Bucharest was actually more about Georgia than it was about Ukraine at the time. And this is where, the reference to a worst of both worlds comes. In Ukraine, at the time of the Bucharest NATO summit, which was in 2008, there wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm for joining NATO at that point. So we have to remember the Ukrainians, the politics in Ukraine have taken all kinds of twists and turns. The Ukrainians are kind of aware that, and this was at the popular level of the population, there wasn't a great overrounding support for going into to NATO. It was more of a kind of an elite project thinking around the Ukrainian president. But in Georgia, there was a full-throated desire at the popular and elite level to become part of NATO. And Georgia had been supporting the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was pushing for a membership action plan to NATO. And it was thought, and I'm still I'm still years later trying to piece together who thought this, because it seems to have been a whole collection of people from all kinds of different backgrounds, that Georgia's case would be strengthened if Ukraine joined in as well. And so this was the kind of fateful decision. A letter was written to George W. Bush asking for Bush's support. President Bush, being a good Texan, this is W rather than HW, was more enthusiastic about supporting the feisty countries of Georgia and Ukraine. This was, of course, after the United States had well and truly waded into Iraq and was trying to pursue the freedom agenda. Bush thought that Ukraine and Georgia and their freedom should also be supported. I mean, I know this because I did a deep dive, a series of them for the president. These were the kinds of things that he said. And he said that if they made an appeal and that on military terms they looked like they had the wherewithal to contribute to NATO, and Georgia already was, and Ukraine at that time, as we now know, actually still had a sizable and capable army, and certainly in terms of being able to, as we've seen over these last years, keep the Russians somewhat at bay, then he would support the membership action plan. The problem is, nobody else really supported it elsewhere in Europe. Partly this was to do with Mikhail Saakashvili and perceptions of him and his role. Others knew that, Ukraine wasn't, fully on board at this particular point, and there was a lot of resistance. And so what happened, though we briefed the President, I and others, that this wasn't likely to happen, we actually briefed against it because we think that under the idea that if you push for something you can't get, it's not a great idea because it just sort of shows up weaknesses and all the kind of divisions. Once President Bush decided to go ahead, there was at Bucharest, as we now know, and we've heard from Chancellor Merkel's memoirs, it was Chancellor Merkel herself who kind of opined, trying to find some kind of solution to some of her Eastern European counterparts at a side table. Well, one day they'll get into NATO. And that kind of rather casual aside of one day that they might get into NATO was pounced on by many of the East Europeans at the table who were quite supportive, a handful of them who were supportive of pushing for Ukraine's membership action plan, as well as Georgia's. That was kind of turned into the text of the Bucharest memorandum. And why it was the worst of both worlds, that one day they will get into NATO, was it wasn't really a promise. It was a kind of an open door, and Putin, of course, wanted to slam that door and jam everyone's foot in it and bash the door off, Ukraine and Georgia's face. And, of course, in August of 2008, Russia does invade Georgia at a pretext over, basically exchanges with peacekeepers in South Ossetia, which, frankly, myself and other colleagues have been warning for some kind of flashpoint in Georgia for a good year before that. There were certainly tensions building up between Georgia and Russia. And Ukraine realizes at that point that it's completely and utterly exposed in terms of security. Membership Action Plan is not Article 5. It doesn't bring you any security at all. And the big flaw in all of NATO, as far as Russia was concerned, was it was backstopped by the United States. Because at this point, Europe hasn't really been contributing, as we all know, to the extent in which it was required. So all of this comes down to a single point of failure in NATO at this point, which is the United States' willingness to kind of really backstop Article 5. And from then on, Putin's trying to test whether the United States is actually willing to, in fact, defend any of its allies, because it knows and finds out pretty quickly, certainly not Georgia, and later on in 2014, certainly not Ukraine.
Constanza, did you have something to...
Well, I just wanted to point out, since Fiona mentioned proliferation, right? There's been in my view, intellectually rather academic debate about nuclear weapons, just in case the Americans, for one reason or another, decided to pivot to Asia. And that academic debate has just gone live, with comments by the incoming chancellor before the election saying that and in response to the speeches by Secretary of Defense Hegseth at NATO and at the NATO Ministerial in Brussels, and then by Vice President Vance in Munich, that Europe was going to have to develop its own nuclear deterrent, that would mean that the French and the British deterrent, which is per se not enough to replace the American deterrent, would have to be expanded, and Germany would have to somehow join in that. I cannot overemphasize what kind of a sea change that is in the politics of my country, right? That used to be an absolute and complete taboo, and we are in fact signatories, right, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I think that what we are seeing here, coming out of this White House, is taking the lid off of many things, including of proliferation worldwide, right? I think that is, and I do not need to describe to anyone the escalation risk inherent in that, right? We have similar debates in Asia, namely in Japan and in South Korea. And I will say that I was at a dinner at NATO before the Munich Security Conference, where an Eastern European said, well, we're going to have to get nuclear weapons too. That is where we are. And that's not a good thing. And let me end this by saying, I personally feel, not only do I think that is ill-advised, but it is of course a response to the fact that Russia has successfully employed the threat of nuclear weapons use in its invasion of Ukraine, and that has served as a significant deterrent against escalation by both the Biden White House and the Scholz Chancellery. So you can understand the political mechanics of this. But the truth is that that discussing a European nuclear deterrent is in many ways a distraction from a much more urgent issue, which is our conventional deterrent deficiencies, and the need to dramatically increase our defense industrial production and defense spending. So I just want to point out that there is a NATO summit in The Hague this summer, and there are a lot of extremely urgent questions hanging over that summit. And you can see from the calendar of EU emergency summits that is now beginning on March 6th, the Council, then a European Union summit, and in the third week of March, I think you will see a ticking up of news out of Brussels and out of Europe on developing an independent deterrent of whatever kind.
All right, we're going to go to audience questions momentarily. If you have a question, flag for me. If you do not formulate your question in the form of a question, or you prattle on, I will cut you off with a shocking lack of due process. Please do wait for the mic. And while we are, he who moderates most aggressively keeps the show going. While you wait for the mic, I want to ask Nastya, one more question, which is, in this conversation, we have focused a great deal on American follies and betrayals. But, you know, in the podcast, we actually spend a bit of time on some Ukrainian follies. And Fiona alluded earlier to the politics of Ukraine being a little bit all over the place. So as a Ukrainian who was not born when any of that happened,
some of it,
some
not
of
all.
it, yeah, some of it was more recent. You know, tell us a little bit about the experience of looking back on Ukrainian history in the course of doing this work.
That was actually extremely fascinating for me because, as you said, a lot of it I haven't lived through. But I was walking into this show with, you know, being aware of the responsibility of, you know, spreading Ukraine's message. And that's why we have an American co-host and a Ukrainian co-host. You know, I had to make sure that Ukraine's history was written right and given justice. So we covered a lot of extremely important topics that are underreported or that Western audiences don't understand. Like, for example, we spent a great deal of talking about language politics because everyone is utterly confused about it. So we had to explain it. But yeah, there were moments where it was very uncomfortable for me and also quite eye-opening that actually it's not just evil Americans who messed it all up. And I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course. I always knew that's not the case. But it was very interesting to see that Americans and Europeans had their great deal of problems, but also very often the Ukrainian government has messed up badly again and again. And we really made ourselves look unreliable, corrupt, and often a lot like Russia as well. And so that was very interesting and very important for me as well to, hi, baby. And so it was very important for me to, of course, be as objective and as truthful as possible, you know, and to put my Ukrainian hat off and my journalist hat on. And I'm proud of all of the work that we've done, and I think it's going to be amazing to see that each issue that we've covered, each summit, each city, each event has these two distinct viewpoints of it and kind of two roots from the American and Ukrainian point of view. So I really hope all of you enjoy it.
So we have a lot of people who want questions. So please keep questions brief. And if you can direct them to an individual, that would be great. Sir.
Michael Lasher, I'm with The Insider. This is probably for Fiona and Constance. The United States government was in possession of at least an approximate Russian invasion plan in October of 2021. The Russians knew we had that plan because Bill Burns went to Moscow and told them. Russian Kremlin-controlled domestic media was showing in the 3 months before the start of the invasion all of the airplanes coming into Kiev with javelins and NLAWs and Stingers. And they were portraying Ukrainians as preparing for war. The 21st of February at the Security Council meeting.
We need this to head toward a question.
Yep. Shoigu talks about how Ukraine is armed and prepared for war. And on the evening that the Russians are actually sent in, the soldiers are woken up in the middle of the night, they're stripped of their cell phones, they don't even see Putin's announcement of the special military operation in which he calls Ukraine a hostile anti-Russia pumped up with modern weapons.
Okay, we need a question.
Does anybody think that was weird?
I don't know how to interpret that.
Well, if we think about the preparations that Putin, I mean, look, I know this period inside out because I was constantly being asked to comment on it and I was watching these things very carefully. I mean, the Russians were preparing the ground, as we knew, for what they were calling a special military operation, and they wanted to have a pretext. There were a number of other things that were happening around this time. I mean, given all of the machinations in Ukrainian politics, in this kind of period, a gentleman named Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a Ukrainian very close to Putin, and Putin is the godfather of Medvedchuk's, one of his daughters, was also basically arrested by the Ukrainians. And Putin is always one person never to let one of his men go. I mean, if you know Mr. Krastikov, the assassin in the Tiergarten, one of the reasons that Evan Gershkovich and all kinds of other people were taken into custody was to try to basically trade for Mr. Krastikov, and that kind of worked as well. So there's all kinds of things happening that are kind of certainly affecting Putin's calculus about the reasons that he wants to go into Ukraine, because he feels, irrespective of what you're describing there that's showing out on Russian television, is that Ukraine is getting away from Russia's grip. And this has been going on for a very long time. In 2014, when Russia moved in to seize Crimea, there were also efforts to take not just the Donbass, but also Ukrainian cities back all the way down to Odessa. So if you want to go back and look at YouTube and all kinds of other missives for 2014, you will see that Russia had launched a campaign called Novaya Rossiya, New Russia, to retake the territory that was first brought into Russia by Catherine the Great. If we go back to 2006, Russia turned off the gas that was transiting across Ukraine. And if we go back to the early 1990s, before you were probably paying any attention to what was going on in Russia, there were all kinds of assassinations of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians because Russia didn't want Ukraine to pull out of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, I'm going to be 60 next year, so I actually have a long memory. And I've been living all of this kind of stuff since basically the 1980s when I was a student in Moscow. My first visits to Ukraine were when it was still part of the Soviet Union. So I've been working on this issue for an extraordinarily long time. And if you take all of this in all of the totality, what you will see is right from the very early 1990s, when Ukraine was being pushed to give up nuclear weapons, there were constituents in Moscow and in Russia who saw every move that Ukraine made as basically a violation of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia and didn't want Ukraine to have any other options to go anywhere else. So every move that Ukraine makes from all this way on can be very well documented as seen as being offensive from Russia's perspective. So by the time you get to the things that you're discussing there, Putin has decided that Ukraine has no right and should not go anywhere at all. And it's not just Ukraine, of course. It's also Belarus. It's also Moldova. It's also Kazakhstan. So it's not just about how things are being depicted about Ukraine. You can see these depictions about many other places as well. And when Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008, exactly the same kind of depictions were happening on Russian television. So you may think it's, because I think that you're presenting something, looking at your face as well, that you're saying that Russia had cause for this. But Russia only has cause if you still believe that everywhere is part of Russia's sphere of influence. Perhaps we can take this outside so you can clarify, but of course it's weird from the point of disinformation because it wasn't actually accurate. But Russia has been gunning for the return of Ukraine basically since the 1990s when Ukraine first got away.
Ma'am?
Thank you so much. This is a question for Fiona, Sarika Gandhi with ITV. What would be your advice to UK Prime Minister Starmer when he is approaching those conversations concerning Ukraine later this week?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has probably figured out very clearly that this is an enormously consequential meeting. And it's not just because of Ukraine, but it's also for the whole future of European security and for the United Kingdom itself. The UK and the United States have extraordinarily important defence relationships. And it's going to be very difficult for European members of NATO to be able to make basically the transition to taking charge of NATO as they are being exhorted to without some kind of transitional period or some bridging by the United States. And also, the UK has made some pretty strong commitments to Ukraine. And I also already referenced polling in the UK showing that there's very large, sizable, considerable support in the UK for still supporting Ukraine, as there is, across the rest of Europe. So the case is going to have to be made, and Prime Minister Starmer has already made some commitments about the depth of UK even willingness to deploy some troops onto the ground in any peacekeeping operation. So the important thing is to get all of this across to President Trump in the best way that he possibly can. And again, I don't want to put words into his mouth. I'm sure he's thinking very carefully. And President Macron is already here. So we're seeing that all European leaders at this particular point are realizing that this is the dawning very much of a new era. and that they have to really figure out where they themselves stand, but how they're going to manage the relationship with the United States, not just with Ukraine moving forward.
We have time for one more question, and it is yours.
So let me thank you so much for an intellectually stimulating but also emotionally troubling discussion. I'd like Constance and Fiona to follow up on their points that there has been a reversal of the worldview of the United States and Russia vis-a-vis Europe. Could you contemplate how this could affect policies to punish Russia, assuming there's a ceasefire? For example, if the United States takes one approach to sanctions, to lift, but Europe doesn't. If Europe wants to punish war crimes, but the United States doesn't, what will this do to the dialogue? Thank you.
Constanza?
It's a good question, to be honest. And I think that there are a number of things here that are in play. Sanctions, the use of the Russian frozen assets as collateral for further expenditures on behalf of Ukraine, Ukraine's EU membership, Ukraine's NATO membership, to which we have paid lip service, but which I think requires some sort of commitment. And then, of course, security guarantees of whatever kind. A German friend of mine, commentator, has said that security guarantees is a pompous word for further weapons deliveries, which at this point I think is a correct description of what we're talking about. There is still this proposal of putting European troops into the theater, most notably endorsed by Keir Starmer. That is something that the Russians violently oppose. And I frankly, to be completely honest here, I can envisage a situation where the Europeans want to be more muscularly supportive, where the White House says that's not what we want, and we are doing the opposite of that, and where there might be quite unpleasant conversations between the White House and individual European countries on whether it was advisable for us to do what we're trying to do. And I'm not sure, I think that will then be another sort of very decisive moment for the transatlantic relationship, which, like the German Chancellor, I have grown up with, and which every German has a sort of, all Europeans like to say that they have a special relationship with America, right? I think arguably German feelings about America, which was a benevolent occupying power for West Germany for more than 40 years, and then midwifed not just the reunification of Germany, but the creation of Europe whole and free through the enlargement of the EU and NATO. This is very hard for a country of 80+ million Germans to digest, that this is no longer a benevolent relationship. But this appears to be, I would not call America an adversary or an enemy, but what we are certainly seeing is hostility.
Fiona, you get the last word today.
Well, I think one thing for us all to bear in mind as well, that Marshall also gets to your question, is that this is actually a global conflict. And we haven't mentioned that, and now we open up a whole door as we're kind of closing the session. But for most of the rest of the world, Ukraine is a proxy conflict with the United States. China is supporting Russia. North Korea is supporting Russia. North Korean troops are in Europe fighting in the Kursk region against Ukrainian troops, and we're always watching to see whether they're spilling over also into Ukraine. And Iran is also supporting Russia. And Nastya talked about Shahed drones. Shahed is obviously the Iranian word for martyr, and Iranians are helping to construct drones on a mass scale in Russia, because the Russians don't have the capability of doing that themselves at the moment, with so many people at the front for this conflict. The peace talks that President Trump has called have been in Saudi Arabia. The Middle East I mentioned because of Iran there is very influential. One of the people involved in the talks is Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who was also behind the scenes involved in the Abraham Accords. So you can see here that there's all kinds of linkages and points here. And South Korea and Japan have been supporting Ukraine because the South Koreans wonder that North Korean troops, if North Korean troops are being prepared or exercising there for some kind of action against South Korea. And Japan is extraordinarily concerned about what the implications are of China supporting Russia in all of this. So as we talk about a negotiation between the United States and Russia, we've left out all of these global dimensions as well. And the Chinese have told the Ukrainians, as I learned from one of the Ukrainian former foreign ministers, look, this isn't about you. It's never been about you. China was a massive investor in Ukraine before the war, and they said we'll invest again when this is all over, because this is really just about the United States. So as we kind of contemplate the way that we've flipped on Europe, there's a whole host of other discussions going on around the globe about what this war is and what the aftermath of it might be. Will North Korea, turn its attention towards South Korea? What will then South Korea and Japan be facing? And will China really be kind of the beneficiary in some respects of this as the country that then reconstructs Ukraine? Or also then moves back, basically into a relationship with Europe. At the Munich Security Conference, there were several very prominent Chinese officials trying not to gloat over the rift between Europe and the United States, but saying to the Europeans, they weren't succeeding because they were very open. We'll be there for you, Europe, when this is all over as well. But they have also, China, been aiding and abetting the largest land war in Europe since World War II. And they were also on the other side of the war in World War II as well. So to be continued, I think.
Yeah, indeed. We are going to leave it there. Please join me in thanking our spectacular panel. And please, if you could, remain in your seats while the panel evacuates the room and heads to a shelter underneath a local hospital. Thank you to Constanza, Tyler, Nastia, and Fiona. Is Escalation, and you should all download it. The first episode is now available. Thank you for coming.